Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our AFA QAR webinar. We might just give our colleagues and peers a moment to log on before we kick off. We're certainly appreciative of people's time, but an important topic. So welcome and thanks for attending. How we're looking, Phil?
Morning, Sam. Looking good. We've got the numbers rolling in. We're over 100 now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
look, I think we should.
Yep. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm the AFA National President, Sam Perera, and of course Phil Anderson, who is infamous in our profession, is going to do much of the content and drill into the presentation. We've also got Kaz, who is joining us, and Kaz will be assisting us with the questions function. Encourage you to ask questions during the course of the presentation. Kaz, please feel free to interrupt myself and Phil, because the more engaging it is, the better informed our members will be. So some housekeeping, just to remind you that you're on mute throughout the session, so you can't ask questions verbally. But please use the chat to log in your questions and answers. Sorry, not the chat, but rather the Q&A function to answer your questions. So welcome again. Phil, do you think we kick off with a poll?
Yes, Sam. Let's call on Mel to launch the poll. Thank you.
We will launch the poll. Launch the poll, please, Mel. And we just wanted to get a sense of the audience, our members' feedback in relation to how you feel about QAR, just so we get a bit of a temperature gauge before we kick off. So how supportive are you of the QAR recommendations? Very supportive, moderately neutral, all the way to moderately opposed and strongly opposed. It's a little bit like the worm, is it, Phil?
Yeah, the numbers are definitely flowing through. We've got a lot of input.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Look, I think we're probably there, Mel. Let's close that off and show the results.
Very supportive to moderately supportive, some neutral, some moderately opposed, and one strong opposition to the proposals. Hopefully throughout the presentation, I was going to cover it off in terms of the agenda. Our objectives are to obviously educate you about some of the intricacies and finer details of the proposals, get you to understand where the AFA leadership team sit in relation to the final recommendations of the QAR proposal. And for those of you who may be moderately or strongly opposed or perhaps neutral on the recommendations, to help you form a better view if in fact you need more facts to do that. So let's kick off with the AFA's view. It's important to start with the position of remembering what the terms of reference were for Michelle Levy's quality of advice review, and that was really to address the accessibility and affordability of financial advice. But if you think about it from our perspective, from a practitioner perspective, what were we screaming out for? We were screaming it out to the regulators to make things easier for us, easier for our clients, and cheaper for our clients. So that was the absolute objective, where all these final recommendations should be measured against. The AFA leadership team, principally myself and Phil, have been very strong supporters of the QAR from the start, and are very strong supporters of the final recommendations, notwithstanding some concerns we have around a couple of the elements. And that's largely because of the extensive engagement that myself and Phil have had with Michelle Levy from the start, as well as other legitimate stakeholders within the profession. Michelle has done a stellar job, even at our conference, from the time she had breakfast with me and a couple of our members. She spent a day meeting and chatting and having consultations with AFA members at our conferences. So the final report's there. We encourage you to read it. We know it's quite voluminous, but certainly to get a handle on Michelle's rationale in terms of how she landed at the recommendations. I highlighted the fact that we don't support 100% of everything, but we do believe it's an excellent blueprint and it's exactly what the profession needed and at the right time. I want to make a remark about some of the opposition that's been misinformed, inaccurate. Some of the positioning has been deliberately misleading and manipulative. One stakeholder outrightly rejecting all of the proposals on the basis that they provide a leg up for the banks and super funds relating to the non-relevant provider issue is absolutely ludicrous. How on earth could you reject all the proposals, all the recommendations, such as removing the disclosure documents, such as removing the FDS, such as rationalising the fee consent form, because you've got one issue with one particular set of the recommendations. However, it is not entirely surprising that that stakeholder has landed on that particular view. But I wanted to call it out. We want to address it and hopefully provide the information to help our members and the wider profession make more of an informed view on where they stand in relation to the final recommendations. I must say we do have a battle in front of us. Yesterday, myself and Sarah Booth, the CEO of the Financial Planning Association and soon to be the CEO of the Financial Advice Association of Australia, once we finalise the merge in the next few weeks, spoke, and we unashamedly, our primary focus will be advocacy for the coming few months and certainly over the course of the 12 months. And you'll get sick of us saying advocacy is our focus, because we've got a mountain to climb in relation to try and get some of these recommendations across the line. But Phil will talk through that as well. What we will be promoting, what we will be working towards is getting as many legitimate stakeholders on the same page to promote a package of quick wins that we can take to the minister, the shadow minister, to try and get their support on. So with all of that, the agenda, as I said, I'd like you to please walk away at the end of this hour educated on the proposals and some of the intricacies, which Phil is a master of getting into the detail on, and he'll do so. I want all of us at the AFA and across the profession to be united in pursuing a quick wins package. I do not want the issue of the non-relevant providers drowning out the noise or the opportunity, the tremendous opportunity that we have to try and get these quick wins across the line. We do not want to be kissing a gift horse in the mouth. So Phil will take you through the recommendations. He'll talk about the stakeholder responses. We'll talk about some of the more challenging elements of the proposals and outline what we think our quick win package is, and happy to take questions and we'll answer them as we go. So Phil, with all of that, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and good morning, everyone. Look forward to spending the next remainder of this hour talking to you about the recommendations in some detail, and we'll provide quite a bit of context about what we think is great out of this and what we think needs to be tweaked. But at the end of the day, we understand where the recommendations are coming from, and we have some very clear views on how we can make them work. I do want to go through them one by one with you, because I think it's important that we do have a full understanding. As Sam said, it'd be great if members could read the actual report, but I will warn you that it's nearly 300 pages. You can probably get away with reading the first 180 odd, which is before they get into the appendices. But as an absolute minimum, I think read the executive summary and the recommendations. So recommendation 1 is about broadening the definition of personal financial product advice. Now, this is really important because what it means is the scope to provide general advice will be substantially reduced, because what it's actually saying is that where you have access, where you are relying upon knowledge of the client's personal circumstances, objectives or needs, or you have access to information on it, you are providing personal advice. So it really changes that boundary between personal and general advice, and it means it'll be much more difficult to provide general advice. It means most of the people who are currently providing general advice will find themselves in the position of providing personal advice in the future. And that means that will largely hit product providers. So product providers who have in the past provided general advice will now find themselves needing to provide personal advice that will be bound by the good advice duty. Now, we'll come back to this point, but if the claims are this review has set out to deliver great outcomes for banks and super funds, then I'm sure they are pretty damn disappointed with recommendation 1, because it's going to make it more difficult for them to provide basic advice. Recommendation 2 is about retaining licensing for general advice, but it'll be much less about one-on-one interaction. It'll be all about webinars and marketing material going forward. But they have suggested that you could remove the warning because it'll be more obvious that it won't be personal advice. Recommendation 3 is about relevant providers. Now, what this is saying is that only relevant providers could be paid a fee or a commission for the provision of financial advice. But it does go on to say in all other cases, personal advice can be provided by someone other than a relevant provider. So what it's doing is saying, broaden the number of people who can provide advice, but only financial advisors can be paid for the provision of financial advice. And this fundamentally changes a number of things. I mean, as we know, you can get paid for providing general advice right now. You won't be able to get paid for providing general advice, and you won't be able to get paid for providing personal advice if you're not a full financial advisor. Recommendation 4 is about the introduction of the good advice duty. And this will apply to all providers of personal advice, including relevant providers or those who are currently known as financial advisors. You'll be required to have the advice fit for purpose based upon an understanding of the client's reasons or purpose for the advice, the scope, content and nature of the advice, and the likely relevant circumstances of the client. Now, people have dismissed the good advice duty, saying people will be able to provide advice uneducated and unconstrained by the current rules. That's not the case. Regulatory Guide 175 that talks to the obligations around the provision of advice also talks to fit for purpose. That will be part of the good advice duty. This is not going to be a low bar. This will be a relatively high bar.
Phil, is it fair to summarize? Phil, sorry, is it fair to summarize that 1, 2, and 3 serve to close some of the loopholes that that may currently be used to circumvent personal advice and the provision of personal advice?
Yeah, it does. And Sam, we'll come back to what the current hierarchy is, because when people have claimed this introduces a 2-tier regime, well, I'll make it clear that we already have a 3-tier regime. So recommendation 5 is about fixing up the best interest duty. Now, I think Michelle Levy has made a few points here. One, she said, is that it's not just the best interest duty. There's, in fact, 4 duties that are connected up and described as the best interest duty and related obligations. Yes, there's the best interest duty, the obligation that the advice is appropriate, the requirement to provide a warning if the information that's being relied upon is inaccurate or incomplete, and then the obligation to prioritise the interests of the client. Now, what Michelle is saying is, let's completely rehash that and come out with a new best interest duty that is much more straightforward, but it's focused on the outcome for the client, not the process the advisor has followed to deliver the advice. So importantly in that will be the removal of the safe harbour, which we know has driven significant increase in costs over recent years as we've been more focused on proving compliance with the best interest duty above and beyond a focus on the actual outcome of the advice itself. Now, our recommendation 6 is one that we will be a bit more sensitive about. It's talking about permitting super funds to provide advice to members that takes into account their family situation and social security entitlements, which has been deemed as out of scope for what can be provided through intra-fund advice in the past. And recommendation 6 also includes a suggestion that the restrictions on collectively charging advice fees be removed. Now, when I talk about collectively charging advice fees, that is intra-fund advice. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Recommendation 7 is to, and this is an important one for us because it gives us greater certainty, update the law to explicitly allow super fund trustees to pay a fee from a member's account to pay for personal financial advice about the member's interest in the fund at the direction of the member. So importantly, it is at the direction of the member. It's Michelle's interpretation that it's a little questionable as to whether the law specifically permits the payment of advice fees. And she's saying, let's clear up the risk of any confusion. Let's make it explicit in the law. Now, recommendation 8 is the absolute no-brainer of all of these recommendations. Remove the obligation to provide fee disclosure statements and enable renewal and consent to be done through a single rationalised consent form. This is the absolute critical one. And, you know, we could see an end, we would happily see an end to fee disclosure statements tomorrow. And I want to talk a little bit more about the history of that in a little while. Recommendation 9 is another really critical one. Removal of the mandatory requirement to provide advice documents unless requested by the client at the time of giving the advice or prior to it. The client cannot come in a week afterwards or a year afterwards and say, I want a copy of the advice document. They've got to tell you before or at the time of providing the advice. And you will still have to produce record-keeping obligations to demonstrate that you have met your obligations. But this is a really big recommendation. And to be honest, you know, I think it was quite revolutionary that she would do that. But equally, it's pretty obvious that SOAs do not deliver value to the vast bulk of clients, but contribute significantly to cost. Okay, 10. Another really straightforward and obvious recommendation is allow advisors and more broadly providers of financial advice to make their financial services guides available on their website, rather than you having to give clients a copy of your FSG or your updated FSG every time you change it before you give another financial service. 11 is related to wholesale clients. Now, I'll talk more about wholesale clients, and obviously we're very conscious that the regime that applies to wholesale clients is a very relaxed regime. What they're saying is that wholesale clients should provide consent to acknowledge the protections that they are relinquishing. So, you know, that's things like the application of a best interest duty, the fact that their advisor needs to complete an exam, the fact that their advisor needs to have completed a higher education level. So they will need to acknowledge that they understand that. 12.1 is amending the DDO legislation to limit. There's currently an exemption that financial advisors can recommend a product to a client if the client is not within the target market determination. Now, what 12.1 is about is saying that should only apply to relevant providers, to financial advisors who are on the FAR. It should not apply to people who are providing personal advice when they are not a relevant provider. Now, that's an important change that was made, and it's to say that exemption would only be available to financial advisors. 12.2 is about exempting relevant providers, not others, relevant providers from some of the DDO obligations, design and distribution obligations. And these are things like reporting significant dealings. Significant dealings are where you might have recommended a product to someone who's outside the TMD, about needing to respond to additional obligations that product issuers might impose on you, and not having that nil complaint reporting obligation. That's currently exempt through an ASIC relief, but Michelle has suggested it needs to be through the law. Now, Really importantly, this one only applies to relevant providers and not to non-relevant providers. So I think Michelle has, in her final report, made some additional efforts to distinguish between relevant providers and non-relevant providers. Now, we get into the conflicted REM area, and there's a bunch of recommendations here. But this first one, amend the conflicted remuneration provisions to explicitly provide that monetary and non-monetary benefits given by the client to an AFSL or a representative, i.e. an authorised representative, are not conflicted REM. And this is just to take some of the complexity out of the legislation. 13.2 is about a specific exemption that permits super fund trustees to pay an AFSL or a representative for the provision of personal advice where directed by the client. So this is making it clear that it's actually permitted for the super fund to do that. 13.3 is about removing the exemptions for benefits paid in relation to the issue, sales or dealings in financial products. Michelle's rationale here is that if payments made by clients are exempt full stop, then it would equally apply in this case. 13.4 relates to a specific exemption that exists for what we describe as transaction-only situations. And this is where an advisor had not provided advice within the previous 12 months. They processed a transaction on behalf of a client where they could be paid conflicted REM. Now, this was something that existed at the time, and I guess it was an option whilst we still had products in the marketplace that paid trail commission, but they've all gone. So this exemption seems to be irrelevant now anyway, so we're not uncomfortable that it would disappear. And once again, we come back to, was this all about doing good things for the banks? Well, 13.5 is about the removal of conflicted REM exemptions for agents and employees of authorised deposit-taking institutions, i.e. the banks. So Michelle has said that those conflicted REM exemptions should be removed. 13.6 relates to timeshare schemes and the suggestion that the government should undertake a separate review of timeshare schemes and their distribution arrangements. Timeshare operators have fairly broad exemptions within the Corporations Act around conflicted REM and around obligations with respect to the professional standards. So Michelle has said that that should be looked at. 13.7, and look, I'll just reflect upon the fact that we had argued for an increase in commissions. We'd also argued for a flat fee to be introduced on top of existing commissions. We'd asked that the clawback in year 2 was reduced. That's what we asked for. We should review this in the context, of course, that Commissioner Haynes suggested that life insurance commissions should eventually be reduced to 0. What Michelle has suggested is to retain the existing LIF exemptions. And look, I'd reflect upon this as a win, because we have at least kept those existing exemptions from conflicted REM provisions. And the tone of the report was to discuss the proposals that have been put forward to increase commissions. The tone was not about whether there was any argument to reduce commissions. 13.8 is about general insurance and the retention of the existing exemption that applies there. And 13.9 was about consumer credit insurance and retention of the exemption that applies there. Equally, I think it's important to say that the report did not recommend any change to the low value or the $300 threshold non-monetary benefit cap, or the removal of the exemption for training and education, or the removal of the exemption for provision of systems and technology. So overall, in terms of the response to conflicted REM, I think we're very happy. We would have loved to have seen a recommendation to increase the lift caps, but we realised that was an uphill battle from the start, and we are at least pleased that we haven't seen any recommendation to reduce those caps. So there are all of the recommendations in detail. Now, I just want to move on to talk about the response that we've seen. The final report was provided to the Minister on the 16th of December. We saw some media coverage in January suggesting the government would be looking for easy wins. And we want to help the government out with identifying what we believe are obvious quick wins that will not be controversial. And we'll talk more about that as we progress through this presentation. By the 8th of February, we saw the report released without any commentary from the government in terms of their support for the recommendations, but a commitment to undertake further consultation. On that very same day, despite the size of the report, Choice came out with a statement describing it as a recipe for another Royal Commission. They didn't stop really to look at all the positives that were in this report, but to get on the front foot politically and use some fairly dramatic wording about it. This is a measure of the battle that we have in front of us to ensure that we can get meaningful change, and we'll need to work very hard this year to make sure that we do get some of those obvious wins up. We're at least starting from the very positive position that we have a report that has proposed from some fairly revolutionary changes, which we can all get behind, we believe, and thus we're starting from at least a strong position. We just need to win the argument from this point.
Phil, we might just pause there and just quickly, Phil. So we might just pause there and take a quick question from Wayne Leggett, which is related. How do you feel about Stuart Roberts' comments that the QAR should be implemented in full and going for quick wins is dangerous? My sense is that, it's this is a little bit of politicking. And whilst we would love for the recommendations to largely be implemented in full, notwithstanding some concerns in and around the relevant provider issue, I think there's little chance of the recommendations being implemented in full. It's a little bit of what we refer to as wedging going on. Phil, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, look, I think Wayne is probably identifying a particularly important strategic consideration, which is, do you go for a package of quick wins and then allow the government to lose interest in the remaining recommendations, or do you hold out and wait for the whole package to be implemented? I think, Wayne, we'll explain what we recommend a little bit later on, but I think if we get what we want, we'll walk away from this very happy. So look, I think it's a really important strategic consideration, and we'll reflect back on that maybe at the end of the session. So just moving on, the big wins, removing fee disclosure statements. I mean, there is no question that that is a huge outcome that will cut significant cost out of practices, but also fee disclosure statements add little value. They're incredibly difficult because of timing differences and other differences that often lead to small variances that could ultimately lead to the FDS being viewed as invalid. It's just an absolute no-brainer. Rationalizing fee consent is another one. One of the real shortcomings of introducing legislation too quickly is that the entire industry is not ready, and you have different people doing different things. We need to refresh the fee consent regime and introduce a standardised approach to it that will make it much more efficient. Rationalisation of the best interest duty and related obligations and removal of the safe harbour steps. I think the best interest duty, whilst it was an important part of the FOFA reforms, there is still a level of uncertainty and anxiety that comes with meeting that obligation. And we've seen a range of reports that suggest a high level of non-compliance. Is that a reflection of the duties itself, or is it a reflection of the advisors? And I suspect it's in large part the complexity of the duty and the difficulty in always being able to demonstrate that you've completely complied with the obligation, where you have to follow the safe harbour steps and you have to have evidence of steps taken and documentation kept to prove compliance with all of those 7 steps, including the last one, the catch-all, which really, in my view, has no place in a safe harbour because it's totally unsafe to ask someone to take all other steps that would reasonably be required to demonstrate compliance with the best interest duty. So that's a really important win. Removing the requirement to provide an advice document unless the client requests, that will allow us to provide simpler advice so much more easily, but also it will provide greater flexibility. You'll be able to provide documentation to a client on your advice, but you can probably do it in 3 pages or 5 pages, not 60 pages or 80 pages. The FSG disclosure obligation is a really easy, quick win. And I think that's a better outcome for consumers as well, because they've often lost their FSG by the time they start to think about making a complaint. Being able to find it on the website is a good outcome. We've talked a bit about the DDO reporting obligations, and I think that what's being proposed there will take some of the administrative load off licensees and advisors when it comes to DDO. And importantly, and we've talked about this already, retaining life insurance commissions, although, as we said before, we would have preferred to see an increase in the caps. The negatives, and I don't need to talk about these in this audience, but there is no question that there has been a lot of pushback on non-relevant providers being able to provide personal advice. I'm going to talk more about that because I think it is really important that we do understand the potential role that may play and how it's not necessarily the same market that advisors are operating within. But I'll go into that in a little while. Greater flexibility in intra-fund advice. I mean, we tend to rely upon the fact that intra-fund advice has a role to play, but it is quite restricted in terms of the types of advice that can be provided. Now, we do believe that there are some fairly fundamental offsetting factors. Broadening personal advice to reduce the role of general advice, and why I'm mentioning this, and I'll talk about it in a moment, is that people who are currently providing general advice are likely to be the people providing personal advice, non-relevant providers providing personal advice in the future. Or they'll be doing similar things. So this is not a step backwards, this is a step forward. They will have a good advice duty that they don't have now. Limiting the receipt of advice fees to only relevant providers. Only allowing relevant providers who are on the FAR to describe themselves as financial advisors. Applying a good advice duty to non-relevant providers and greater controls around wholesale client advice. Now, likely pushback, and we've seen this already, and it's not it doesn't come as a surprise, and we've seen it consistent with all the major reforms over the last 2 decades. There will be strong views expressed, and some of the consumer groups got out on day one with their objections. But we've been here before. We understand how it plays out. We've got to play the long game. We've got to be able to defend these reforms against the accusations that are made against them. And some of those accusations will be things like, these are trashing the FOFA reforms. And that's a deliberate claim because it's designed to undermine the support of the ALP, who are the architects of the FOFA reforms. Removing consumer protections, which will always be a claim that are made by consumer groups, that for some reason this is stepping back on consumer protections. But we rightly challenge, of those consumer protections that are being removed or reduced, did clients actually value them? Did clients actually need them? Were clients prepared to pay for them? And of course, as Sam has suggested, there'll be some allegations that the recommendations are designed to benefit the banks and super funds. Well, I think it's a balance. I think some will benefit them, but some will definitely not benefit them, such as the change on the definition of personal advice. Now, our response, and we'll talk to this, is these reforms do not trash any of the FOFA reforms. We have years of experience about what consumer protections work. And this is certainly not a clean win for big institutions. This is really about clients and achieving better outcomes for clients. And sometimes that means that the balance needs to be changed. All right, so I want to explain the challenges that are in front of us, but I want to do this to help people understand some of the issues behind the recommendations. Okay, removal of fee disclosure statements. Some people will argue that this is a fundamental breach of the FOFA reforms. What I want to highlight is that when FOFA was first announced on the 26th of April 2010, and I know this is a history lesson, there was no requirement to do fee disclosure statements. At that stage, the recommendation was to do annual opt-in. Annual opt-in. Funny about that. It was a year later when Bill Shorten was the minister that they introduced the concept of fee disclosure statements, apparently as a compromise with industry to reduce the frequency of opt-in so that it was every 2 years. The Hayne Royal Commission then came along and demanded annual renewal, and also that this would apply to all fee-paying clients. Remember, and opt-in, when it was first introduced, only applied to post-1 July 2013 clients. Thus, the practical reality is that with the combination of the modifications to the FOFA reforms and the Hayne Royal Commission recommendation, the frequency has gone back to annual. So we are absolutely where we started this in April of 2010. So the removal of fee disclosure statements is consistent with the original proposal. And most importantly, it will fundamentally reduce the cost. There was reports at the time in 2010 and 2011 that fee disclosure statements and opt-in would not be an expensive thing to produce. We know, with the benefit of hindsight, we knew at the time, but we certainly know with the benefit of hindsight, they are incredibly expensive to produce. And we've even got an ASIC report that says you need to log into product systems to confirm that you've got the amounts right. Clients do not need fee disclosure statements because they already get fees disclosed in their regular product statements. The removal of advice documents. Now, I think this is one that will take a little bit of working through, and I don't think it will necessarily be a universal approach. We probably expect to see there'll be a graduated approach based upon advice complexity and client preferences. And you all know, with working with your clients, that some won't even read them, some won't even open them, some will. Maybe we put those in the professions of engineers and school teachers, and they will look at SOAs. Licensees will deal with this differently, depending upon their propensity for risk aversion. They may not want to completely walk away from advice documentation. So we would expect to see some implementation issues. We've got to ensure that this does work in the best interest of advisors and clients, and work through how we have confidence about being able to defend a claim, whether that claim is through the courts or through AFCA. All of these things will need to be worked through carefully. I believe it will work to deliver an outcome where the advisor can choose how much documentation is provided. They'll do it in consultation with clients. I'm sure that it will be a solution where in most cases there will be a brief explanation. There will be something that is documented. However, it will be client-centric. It won't need to start with a cover page. It can be just a letter. This is what I recommend, and this is why. Importantly, the obligation to complete the advice process will not disappear, and you'll still need to retain documentation, but it will make it much more efficient and it will be much more client-centric. Impact on intra-fund advice. Now, I just want to start by explaining what intra-fund advice is. It is not a different regulatory regime. If there are people who think people providing intra-fund advice are somehow avoiding the obligations, that is not true. Currently, they need to provide statements of advice. They need to comply with the best interest duty, and professional standards apply. Intra-fund advice is only personal advice. So all of those obligations apply. But through Section 99F of the SIS Act, intra-fund advice is actually a mechanism for the collective charging of fees for advice. So it's built into the admin fee. It only applies to relatively simple advice, such as advice on investment choices, on insurance coverage, and it can only be once off. It can't be ongoing advice. Now, look, I know there's a lot of opposition to intra-fund advice amongst advisors, but we actually believe that it has a role to play in enabling the provision of simple advice to people who could not otherwise access it or afford it. I think it's a good thing that people are engaging with their super fund and they are getting simple advice. Our concern about intra-fund advice is it disguises the cost of financial advice. If you don't know how much it costs, then you're not going to put the same value on it. We suspect that the reality is the majority of people who access intra-fund advice are not the target market for financial advisors. They have people who might have small balances and have simple needs, and this is one way for them to get advice that they wouldn't otherwise get. Now, the complication with a QAR recommendation is that it's been suggested to remove the constraints on what can be provided on a collectively charged basis. So that's one of the definite sensitive points that we have on the QAR recommendations.
Phil,
all right, moving.
Phil, sorry, this relates to the non-relevant provider issue as well, but isn't Michelle Levy's counter-argument that trustees are unlikely to provide comprehensive advice under this model because trustees would have a difficulty in justifying, let's say, for example, a comprehensive plan costs $3,000 and then charging the member pool for the $3,000 because they can't charge the individual $3,000. So there'd be concerns about them breaching their fiduciary duties. Isn't that sort of Michelle's point in relation to that, or counter-argument in relation to that objection that we've got?
Yeah, that is one of the counter-arguments. And of course, they are competing against other funds in terms of what their admin fees are. So if they build a lot of expensive advice into their admin fee, they'll become uncompetitive. So let's confront this issue of non-relevant providers. Now, I think that the fear is in a few ways: loss of clients by advisors, lack of a level playing field, and also we've heard arguments about poor behaviour by non-relevant providers could cause collateral damage for the reputation of financial advisors. Now, in our view, these concerns could have been addressed by controls and limitations on the type of advice that can be provided by non-relevant providers. We want them to be providing simple advice and significantly higher education standards for non-relevant providers who are providing personal advice. We don't think working on the basis of RG 146 is a satisfactory outcome. And we have obviously put these arguments to Michelle and the QAR project up to this point. The reasons for concern. So whilst we have argued about this, Michelle has argued that it should be the licensee who decides what type of advice they can provide and how qualified they need to be. And I think Michelle genuinely expects that licensees, as Sam said, will only provide simple advice through non-relevant providers, and they will ensure that their people are adequately qualified. The consequences for them getting this wrong are really quite significant. And we would certainly not want non-relevant providers providing complex advice like retirement planning advice. They simply would not have the qualifications to provide this type of advice, whether that's understanding all the tax implications, understanding the social security implications, or more importantly, or equally importantly, I should say, understanding all the emotional issues that need to be dealt with when you are working with people who are in the process of retiring. Now, look, education is really important. We think that non-relevant providers need to be more highly educated. We actually think this provides an opportunity where it could create a pathway for people to come through the non-relevant provider role and ultimately end up with completion of the full qualifications required to be a relevant provider. At the moment, there is no easy pathway. It's all or nothing. This may provide some sort of pathway for these people to come through. Now, I want to confront some of the misunderstandings about this. When people say the non-relevant provider recommendation will introduce a two-tier regime, we already have a three-tier regime. We have people providing general advice who have very few obligations that apply to them. We have personal advice provided by relevant providers, where you have a truckload of obligations that apply to you. And then we have wholesale-only clients. And I've talked about this earlier on. There's no need to provide an SOA. There's no best interest duty. There's no AFCA rights. There's no IDR rights. There's no exam. There's no education standard. So we've already got a three-tier regime. Now, on the wholesale-only space, there will be further restrictions around clients providing consent. What we actually envisage will happen is that a lot of advice that's currently provided as general advice will be provided as personal advice by non-relevant providers. We also think through the other recommendations and the reduction in the cost of providing personal advice, that more advice will be provided by relevant providers, by financial advisors. So we actually see this as increasing the regulatory obligations that apply. If you replace general advice with personal advice that's bound by a good advice duty, you're increasing the regulatory obligations. I want to go further. I want to talk about who the target audience is going to be for non-relevant providers. And in this, if you put these clients on a 2x2, and you talked about the complexity of the advice and the client's capacity to pay for advice, I very much envisage that this will be addressing a consumer segment that is not currently a target for advisors, because the advice is not sufficiently complex and the client's capacity to pay is not sufficient. These are not part of the target market. That's why I'm saying a good outcome is targeting a completely different segment. If there is crossover or a material crossover, then maybe that's not such a good outcome. Now, I also want to challenge our membership on this particular issue. We have got behind the fact that the Quality of Advice Review was all about improving access and affordability for consumers. We acknowledge that with less than 16,000 advisors in Australia, we simply don't have the capacity to meet the needs of all Australians. We fundamentally believe in the value of financial advice. the great value that it delivers. So how can we frame an argument that says that a huge proportion of the Australian population should have no access to any form of personal advice? So we ask our members the question, are you willing to service these clients for a fee that they can afford? And we know they can't afford a significant amount. Do you turn clients away because their needs are too simple or they do not have the capacity to pay the fees that you require? How do we find a solution where these people can get access to advice? And we said, there is possibly a silver lining here in that these clients with a little bit of personal advice when they're younger may be better clients when they are ready to get full financial advice from a relevant provider. We also talked about it possibly being a pathway. I'm just about to finish, Sam. We're just going to kick in quickly with this poll question. We're going to ask the audience, which of the main recommendations do you support? So, Mel, if you can please launch this poll, we'll get people to respond to the poll, and then we will move on to listen to Sam talk about the quick wins solutions. So, yeah, please let us know your thoughts on broadening the definition of personal advice, removing fee disclosure statements. I don't want you to spend a lot of time on that because that is a no-brainer. Rationalising the best interest duty and removing the safe harbour, removing the mandatory obligation around advice documents, and also, lastly, the one that we do anticipate will be more sensitive, non-relevant providers.
And if there are media on the call, we'd prefer you to discuss what you published with Phil or myself before you publish, because we're this is for the benefit of myself, Phil, our leadership team, and our strategy going forward. What have we got? The poll results.
Yeah. What are we at? Still, the numbers are slowly going up, but we are running a bit short of time, Mel. So let's close this off, and we'll quickly go through the results. So, on one, broadening the definition of advice, 92% support. Removing fee disclosure statements, 99% support. There is one person out there who doesn't want to see that happen. Rationalising the best interest duty and remove the safe harbour, 100% support. Remove the mandatory obligation to prepare advice documents, 87% support. And interestingly enough, even allowing non-relevant providers to provide personal advice, 62% support, 38% opposition. That is not a surprise, but we very much appreciate that feedback. I'm going to now hand over to Sam to talk about our quick wins before we've got some quick time for Q&A.
Yes, look, I won't labour too much on it. At the onset, I wanted to ensure that we provided you with information to enable you to make an informed decision about the proposals and the final recommendation, reminding you that the whole review was about increasing the accessibility and affordability to advice, and also to make things easier for us, for our clients, and make it cheaper for our clients. So hopefully what we've set out demonstrates the fact that, by and large, the final recommendation set forth by Michelle Levy does that. I also wanted to see if we can get on the one page between our members here and the broader profession, including all the legitimate stakeholders, to ensure that the noise, of course, the important noise relating to non-relevant providers, does not drown out our intent to try and get some quick wins across the line that the profession so desperately needs. So we don't want to be looking that gift horse in the mouth. So what are we going to promote? Our strategy is to promote is to go after some quick wins, rather than listening to the shadow minister and wait for the full package to go through and all the debate that would ensue, that it'd take for us to get to that point. So remove FDSs, rationalising fee consent, removing the requirement to provide an advice document. You know what? If you want to provide an SOA, go for your life. If certain licensees want to build hybrid documents that their ARs will support, go for your life. But for those that don't want to provide an advice document, or as professionals want the discretion to be able to decide the type and the breadth of document that they will provide their clients, well, that's what we're going to support. Rationalising bid and DDO, changing the FSG obligations and removing the additional DDO reporting obligations. So how do we do it? We are now firmly in the world of politics. And really, as much as most of these make sense to us, they are good wins, great outcomes for our clients. We've got to get the stakeholders on the one page and to get that unified support. Furthermore, with everything that's on the legislative timetable and with everything that the Labor government has got on their plate, it's a matter of trying to get this report and these recommendations accelerated up the hierarchy to get the airtime of the federal cabinet to try and get these swift wins, if you like, or our priorities implemented as quickly as possible. And that's going to take a mammoth effort. So unified support, all the legitimate stakeholders, including all our members, getting on the one page and saying, hey, this is good for our clients and good for the profession. Advocacy at multiple levels. Now, we haven't launched a grassroots campaign, but I think it's vitally important, if you do get the opportunity, for those of you that are politically connected, that know your local members, etc., get in front of them, talk to them about the quality of advice review, talk about the fact that the Labor government came in and said that they were going to fix the hot mess, and you've got a perfect opportunity to do that. So the more voices that are heard within the corridors of Parliament, the better our case in terms of succeeding. And clearly articulate the consequences of taking no action. And importantly, if you've learned something today about the 2-tier versus 3-tier, about non-relevant providers, etc., for those for other people within our profession that perhaps might take viewpoints from a standpoint where they're not entirely educated about the current workings of the system, I ask you to ensure that you try and do your level best to educate them, to ensure that the noise around the more contentious elements of these proposals don't impede or get in the way of us pursuing our quick wins. So we've got 4 minutes. Kaz, I'm going to take charge of the questions really quickly so I can jump through them if that's okay. Phil, Lift Commission, Karen asks, client consent's required by signing the ATP, but if we're getting the SOAs, how are we going to do them? Really quickly, please.
Yeah, the reality is we're going to need to have some sort of consent form, and if you're going to give a letter that explains the advice and discloses the commissions that you are paid, we'll just need to add a consent page to the bottom of that. It is an obligation, but it's not inconsistent with where we've been at, and realistically, we didn't think that risk advice would be done in an undocumented form.
Even if it's signing a quote, for example, Phil, would that be sufficient?
Look, I think we need to examine all those options, and we would work it out with Treasury, but that may well be an option.
Okay, great. So, Lennon, you speak about the indication of a timeline for the potential implementations of the recommendations. It is true that Stephen Jones is calling for a second review, although he's come out and clarified it. The AFA has been reached out to by Treasury, suggesting that consultation's going to open. Phil, when do we think, best case scenario, this will get on the legislative timeline? Are we talking about maybe May, June?
Well, I think it's going to be on Treasury's timeline pretty soon. The question is, when are we likely to see anything in the Parliament? And that's likely to be a little bit later this year if it goes to plan. There's nothing that's guaranteed. That's why we're saying advocacy is so critical. We've got to make it absolutely a priority for the government to do something in this space, and we've got to work hard to achieve that outcome.
And I must say, your boards are pushing the management teams of the AFA and the FBA and the newly formed Financial Advice Association of Australia very, very hard to ensure that we move as quickly as we possibly can, because we know that the profession needs it. Jake asks about scope. What is scoped out can breach COE in terms of broader implications of advice. Phil, what are your thoughts on that? COE,
Code of Ethics. Thanks, Jake. The reality is that, yes, this is an issue. but the government has committed to doing a review of the Code of Ethics, and this is one of the points that we'll be pushing. We want confidence to be able to provide scoped advice. So we hope that we'll get that outcome.
Thanks, Phil. Anonymous has asked about, someone acting as a customer service, getting free advice. Clients think that they can get free advice, so why would they ever pay for advice? Well, we understand that that's a risk. We feel that quarantining the type of advice that can be given, moreover, mandating high levels of education reduces that risk. And we also submit that our members, my peers, your peers, our colleagues, may not necessarily service certain elements of the market, and they deserve the dignity to be able to access the financial advice, to be able to have a dignified retirement and get towards financial independence. So I'm sorry I've rushed through that answer. Jake refers to, instead of reform due to professional fee structure, why would you provide government subsidies like Medicare for medical mental health? Jake, trying to get tax deductibility across the line, which the FBA has been doing a brilliant job on, has been such a mammoth effort. I don't know how we'd go about getting subsidies for financial advice, especially given the disarray within the federal budget at the moment. Phil, please don't ever retire, says James. So that's important. Karen, what are the chances of all these recommendations being implemented, and when will the changes start from, Phil?
Well, that's the big challenge in front of us. It's why we've identified a set of quick wins, which we believe are relatively easy to legislate and could happen relatively quickly. We can't answer this question. It will be determined by how effective we and others are in our advocacy activity, but it just prioritises the significance of this. Nothing is guaranteed. We have to work really hard to get it.
Very good. Thank you. Look, a couple of questions. I know we're over time. We'll take them until we start to see people disappear. Dwayne asks about a strategic PR campaign to promote Australians to seek advice from registered planners. Great idea. I think certainly in terms of the association or the work of now the merged entity, the priority has to be about prosecuting to get QAR in force. Then, of course, with a more efficient, well-capitalised business that we will have as our association, as your association, we would certainly be looking for ways to promote financial advice and seeking financial advice through financial planners. How do we get some other stakeholders on side, Wayne? I think it's education. I think it's fighting fiction with fact. And I think there are some stakeholders, kind of like being in opposition in government, that make noise for the sake of getting some headlines. You can't always win, but we'll try our best. Who is Stephen Jones?
Sam, the other thing I'd say is I think people need to push back as well. I think, you can't just take everything that is said and assume it's true. People need to be prepared to push back on things, and they need to hold other groups accountable to make sure they are acting in the best interest of the advisor population. If we come out of this with no reforms, then who are we going to blame?
Absolutely. But certainly the legitimate associations, the AFA, the FPA, and all the associations that sit around the joint table of the Joint Association Work Group well behind a package of quick wins and in principle, broad support for most of the recommendations that the AFA supports. Rod, a great question. Why were retention of life insurance commissions left out of the quick wins package, Phil?
Well, it's the recommendation was to keep it. So we absolutely accept that recommendation, but we're not actually asking for anything because we don't require any change for LIF to be kept. So it's an endorsement of it, but we don't require them to change anything for it to be kept.
Thank you. Single consent for insurance commissions fine for regional advisors, but what about when an advisor buys a book of clients? I think that sort of detail, Alan, is something that we'll work through with Treasury once officially. No,
Sam, it's very clear that you only need consent once, and we will certainly be arguing that consent is retained when there is a an assignment of those contracts.
Okay. Anything further on education standards, Phil? It's on a high priority for us.
Yeah, we are expecting the government to consult again on education, and the minister said before Christmas that he intends to have something in the Parliament around the middle of the year. We absolutely understand how important it is to get certainty on this. It has dragged on for too long, and advisors need to know where they stand so that they have as much time as possible to do what they need to do.
Thanks, Phil. Look, one final question. Karen asks about the final QAR report. I think if you just Google final quality of advice review report, it takes you to the Treasury website and you can download it there. What does the AFA think about super? Well, look, we haven't really had the time to sit down and digest it and form a view in its entirety, but we did meet with the Shadow Minister along with our FBA counterparts last Friday. And I think it's fair to say we have some concerns around the indexing and certainly about the unrealised capital gains. But with what we've had with the merger and quality of advice review, we haven't had the opportunity to put the time into that just yet. But look, I'll close it off because we've got some great questions here, and I think one quick one: do we need to re-sign an OFA on an annual basis? Yes, you will, Vadim. But look, I really want to thank you for your participation. We've had some great numbers, some great questions. Hopefully, we've given you some material to help you understand the recommendations, and hopefully, we've achieved our objective of getting you on the same page in supporting a quick wins package and grounding out some of the other noise, although there are some important objections to traverse. Thank you for your support of the AFA, the Financial Advice Association of Australia, as it comes together in the next few weeks, aspiring to represent as the most legitimate voice for up to 80% of the members of the Financial Advice Register, is absolutely dedicated and committed in the advocacy space to get these wins across the lines as quickly as humanly possible. And beyond that, of course, to support the profession, maintain the integrity of the profession, and put on some cracking events for you so we can hear from the best of the best. And my wish and my desire is over the next coming 5 years, there'll be far less policy updates and more updates about practices thriving, more clients getting advice, and strategies to get clients more financially independent and better off. So with all of that, thank you for your participation. You've committed a good hour of your time, and thank you for your support of the AFA. And thank you, Phil.
Thanks, Sam.